Hi and welcome. We're absolutely delighted to have Professor Julie Hodges join us today. So change in organisations is inevitable. However, it's disruptive, it's risky. And so what we wanted to do is to really reach out to one of the leading experts on change. And so we've invited Julie, who's a leading expert on change, and she's devoted her professional and academic career to discovering the secret to effective change. So this is all part of the build up to our CIPD London Organisation Development and Design session, which is coming up in February, and you'll be able to see a link in the comments below. So Julie is Professor of Organisational Change, she's an advisor, she's part of Durham University, and she really has sort of devoted her career to understanding and creating change in organisations. So prior to her academic career, she worked at FTSE 100 organisations, both as an internal and external practitioner. Means she's one of those few individuals who's uniquely placed to really shape how we approach change. And not only that, she's been a pioneer of change before it was even fashionable as well. And so she's really been a leading voice in this area. One of the really nice things that she does is she combines the best research with a really accessible, practical approach. And luckily enough, our CIPD session actually coincides with the launch of her new book, People Centric Organisational Change. And it's all about engaging employees with business transformation, which I understand, Julie, is out on February the 3rd. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. I'm really excited about this one. Definitely. Yeah. I'm delighted to be here to talk with you today. So thank you.
Brilliant. And what we really like about what Julie does, particularly because HR is an evidence-based profession, is what she shares is all empirically proven tools. It's research-based as well. So you won't find any of the sort of the change fads that you see in sort of common parlance and literature as well. So Julie, can I just ask just a first question is what has led you to sort of devoting your career to supporting practitioners and organizations through the change process?
Yeah, really good question. It started many years ago when I did a master's, and my dissertation and master's, I looked at job satisfaction. And out of that, there came a lot of findings around the impact of change on people's job satisfaction and morale in organizations. And then that led me on to doing a part-time PhD, which actually looked at the impact of change on levels of stress in organizations. And also the work that I have done both as a practitioner, which has involved leading and managing organizational change projects across the globe. When I entered academia and began teaching the subject, I was very conscious that there were two types of books. There was the populist books, the ones about who moved my cheese and my iceberg is melting. And on the other side, there were pretty heavy academic tomes. There appeared to be at the time nothing in the middle that actually was grounded in research but had a practical aspect to it. So that actually took the research and looked at what are the practical implications of this. So that led me to look at writing books that fell into that area.
Yeah, and I've got to say, obviously I'm supposed to be neutral in these conversations, but as a practitioner out in the field delivering change, we always have these books to hand at any one time, and it often make you feel really resourced and really accessible. So like, for example, some of the really good practices that came out of this particular book was about assessing change readiness. So often organizations just launch into change, don't they? It's like there's a business imperative to do it, and yet we launch into it. And you sort of encourage people to do things like explore the ghosts of changes past. What is it about organizations that makes them sort of lurch into these change programs and continually make the same mistakes over and over again?
Yeah, I think that sometimes there's lots of drivers for change that can be internal and external. Sometimes organizations want to keep up with the best management fads and fashions that are happening. Sometimes they're under real pressure to change. If they have to restructure, they have to downsize. So there's different reasons for change. I think what we see now in a sort of post-pandemic world is that change is accelerating, and it's accelerating because it's being driven by technology. So I think now there are different needs, there are different approaches to change. And often what happens is that organizations use the same models and the same frameworks. And a lot of those models and frameworks were developed, in the 1950s right through to the 1990s. So it's about, I think what we need to look at is looking at what's fit for purpose now in organizations and in the future as well.
Yeah, I think I sort of cut my teeth originally with things like John Cotter's, is it 8-step model, and his
Yes.
burning platform for change, which
Yeah.
very much of its time was incredibly powerful, wasn't it? Because it helped people understand that change could be broken down. But do you feel with the change, and sort of looking at previous things that you've talked about, you said change in itself has changed from incremental change to transformational change to, I think you're talking about emergent change now as well.
Mm. So yeah, so I mean these what I call the classic linear approaches to change, where they had a time, they had a purpose. But if we look at them now in the context in which organizations are operating in, they're no longer fit for purpose. For example, change does not happen in a linear fashion. It doesn't happen when we want to go from A to B. Change is much more cyclical. Sometimes we have to go back over and review what we have done and look at doing it differently as well. A lot of these classical models also do not focus on engaging people with change. They're very process centric, and absolutely you need a process if you're looking at what I call planned change, but you absolutely need to look at engaging people in change, and that's engaging the people that are within the organization, the employees, but also looking externally at stakeholders, whether they are partners, part of the community, and so on too. So yeah, there are flaws, I think, in a lot of these classic models, in fact, that mean that it's no longer fit for purpose. One of the things that I have done in my new book that's coming out in February is actually based on my research. I have developed a cyclical model for change, but that model doesn't stand on its own. What it has is it has a number of key principles that support that model that is fit for purpose now and hopefully for a few years in the future as well.
Yeah, principles are so important when it comes to change too. So one of the things that obviously you're talking about is kind of a little bit counterintuitive though, because often when we want to create change, we want to go quickly, and often sort of making change more participative, where we're reaching out to employees and external stakeholders. There's the perception that it kind of slows things down. But often that means, but on the back end of the change, things go much quicker because people are bought in, and you don't necessarily get, people maybe working against the change or not fully aligned with it as well. Is that an argument that you often have to sort of address with senior leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. Change doesn't happen if people aren't involved and engaged in it. Change is all about people changing the ways that they work, changing their behaviors, changing how they actually implement new processes, new systems, how they use technology in their jobs as well. And it doesn't need to take a long time. It's about having conversations, which can be done, online, face to face, and creating a bit of space that allows people to actually share their ideas about what they think could be improved and done differently, sharing their concerns about any change that's being proposed, sharing any fears that they have too. So it is about having conversations, and these conversations that can take place in a safe place where people feel it's okay. It's okay to say, actually, this is what we need to do differently, or this isn't going to work, or I'm a bit concerned about the impact of this change on my job itself too. And if these conversations are done in a way that is guided and facilitated, then it doesn't need to take a lot of time. People really want to raise their voice when it comes to change. We're all used to change. We move house, we get married, we get divorced, we change jobs and so on. So actually we're used to it. Change has got a bad name because people often are faced with change being imposed on them. We don't like that when somebody tells us we have to do something in work that's different and nobody has asked us about it. We don't know the rationale for it, in fact. So creating that time to have conversations is absolutely vital.
Yeah, I think in your book you came up with an example of what would it be if you surprised your family with a holiday trip, and you just announced it to them, and you expected them to be really grateful because things are going to be great, they're going to have a brilliant experience. I'm sure you can tell this better than I can, but then you're surprised by the reaction when people aren't grateful, because it is very disruptive as well. It's almost like senior leaders need to have a bit of an upgrade in the way in which they think about change as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, again, one of the things that I've written about in this book is there's a chapter about reframing the role of managers in change. And the pandemic has seen many people work from home where they haven't had a manager looking out over their shoulder. So they have started to get some autonomy in the way that they work. And that is what's needed when it comes to change as well. The old style of change, which was very much top-down command and control, no longer fits organizations now. There has to be a reframing and looking at, okay, how can managers begin to have the capabilities where they are able to facilitate change, where they're able to create time to have conversations, where they're able to listen to what people are saying as well. That's important. And also to pick up on these ideas. Now, there might be ideas that come to the fore that are not acceptable for various reasons, but it's being clear about that that's important. Whereas there may be some improvements that people have identified that really are going to have an impact on the organization and improve its productivity and well-being. Managers also have to be much more cognizant of the impact of change on people's well-being. And again, in the book, I have a whole chapter on well-being, which has rarely been written about in any of the other books on change itself. So change does have an impact, obviously, on organizational efficiency, but it also has an impact on people's health and well-being. And that can show itself in many different ways in organizations. So it's about ensuring that managers have the time to be able to recognize the impact of change and to cope with it as well. And one of the ways, I guess the most common question I'm always asked is, how do we deal with resistance to change? So again, what I have done is I've written a complete chapter that looks at how do you deal with opposition of change. And my thesis in that chapter is actually to turn opposition resistance on its head, rather than seeing it as negative, to actually look at to first of all look why people may resist change. What's the underlying reason for that? Now, it may be because they're just being downright stubborn, and that has to be dealt with, obviously. But it also might be because actually nobody's asked them about the change, and they may have different ideas that need to be considered as well. That's important too. So again, it's looking at what is the future of managers within change as well. That's really important.
Yeah, it's really turning things around, isn't it? Because I guess, like, you talk about the well-being thing, and often the burden of responsibility when it comes to well-being, if you look at well-being programs, is on the employee. Better sleep hygiene, better the way in which you do self-care and that. But often the organizational context is the driver behind people's well-being as well. So I'm really glad that you're bringing that into the conversation, that the organization has a role to play. Do you feel from the research that organizations actually get that yet, and are willing to sort of look at their part of their responsibility in that? And because the big question is like, if people's well-being is at stake, would organizations be willing to sort of pull back on the pace of change to look after that?
So I think a lot of organizations are doing some fantastic things now when it comes to well-being. It's fantastic that it's now on the agenda of most organizations, and organizations are putting into place lots of different well-being practices. But I think it still needs to be linked to change and the impact that change is having on individuals as well. And yes, individuals have responsibility. We all have responsibility to look after our own well-being. But also, it's really important, I think, that organizations themselves take time to think about, okay, if we're implementing this structure or we're moving to a new IT system, what might be the impact on people's health and well-being of this, and what can be put into place to help them as well, and to monitor that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It might well be that senior leaders need to talk to their boards and say, look, the change can't happen as quickly
Yeah,
because we need
indeed.
to watch out for it as well. Really interesting. And
Mhm.
I really like the way you're flipping over the whole idea of moving away from resistance to change, which is just such a common, almost like a lazy phrase that people use, isn't it? When people start to think around the reasons why people are behaving, and actually equipping people to think, so what's actually going on beneath the surface? Because I guess that's the big part of OD, isn't it? What is a symptom,
Yeah.
and what's the underlying problem?
Yeah, opposition to change is not going to go away. It's a natural reaction.
It's a good thing in a way, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's how it is, I think, dealt with, how it is recognized that it is important, in fact. So rather than ignored, it is about addressing it.
So I guess because we're in the session that we're running that's coming up in February, and there's kind of sort of four key areas that you're looking at in terms of what opposing voices might be like. And one of the things that you look at is understanding diverse reactions to change. And it is about, you're talking about potentially equipping managers with more sort of psychological awareness of what is actually going on for individuals, both emotionally and, mentally for them at the same time.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And change is an emotional process. I talk about that in the book that you showed earlier. It is an emotional process. It does hit, how we feel. We don't often show how we feel at work because, again, it's one of these things that, when we walk into our workplace, we tend to leave our emotions behind. But change can have that impact, which means that people will react in different ways. And it's being able to recognize the different approaches that people will have to change. Some people may be ecstatic and really open and welcome it. Other people may be quite scared of the impact of change, and therefore that may well lead them to react in what we perceive to be opposition, when actually it's coming from a place of fear or uncertainty. Change does create uncertainty. There's lots of research that looks at that as well.
Yeah, I think you used the word like emotional labor. Is that right? What's your
Mm-hmm.
definition of emotional labor?
Well, the emotional labor, according to the research, is about when we go to work and we put on a smiley face, with somebody that's in a shop or who's serving people on an airplane. They are constantly enacting emotional labor because they may underneath feel tired, exhausted, whatever, but they still have to put on that smiley face,
Right. So even side people may be like unhappy with the change, but they have to get on the bus, as they say.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
The other thing you talk about is mindsets and sort of fixed versus growth. Is that something that is innate that people are born with, or can you sort of help managers to help their people develop that growth mindset to help them adapt to and embrace the change that's coming?
Yeah, I think we all have the ability to change our views, change our so-called mindsets about change in the organization. I think it's how it's positioned that's important. So people need to firstly be very clear on what's the rationale for change. A couple of years ago, I did a global research project, and one of the key findings that came out of that makes people most concerned about change and react in a defensive way is the fact that no one has told them the reason for the change. The change comes from the top down, and people are expected to do something different, often without a lack of training or coaching or mentoring. So there has to be that clarity on what's the rationale for the change. Why is this change happening? Is it just for the sake of change, or is there a really clear business reason for the change to happen itself?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess a lot of the sort of the communication that comes out is focused on what this is what's going to happen, this is what we're doing. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to get people to unlearn what they've done previously and all these different initiatives that they've invested lots of their efforts into, and they're going to have to adapt to a new way, you need to really give people a rationale why, and
Yeah,
what are the trade-offs and what are some of the difficulties. And one of the things I think you talked about as well is about the being clear on what's not changing as well, because often
absolutely.
we
Yeah,
think change with a big C, which actually
yeah.
often sometimes change with a small c, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a really vital point, that there's a need to be clear on, what in the status quo will stay the same. People need to know, yes, what's changing, but also what will they, find that is part of the status quo, which won't change at all. That's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess when you're going through change as well, again, you sort of quote like, is it William Bridges and
Mhm.
sort of the transitions, and he talks about going into the neutral zone because often it's difficult for managers to keep that communication going. Change takes time from the moment you announce it to the moment you actually execute. It can be quite a prolonged period, and often there's a sort of a fallow period in the middle, isn't there, where it's like, what's going to happen next. How do managers keep that communication going to keep the energy and the focus up, and
Yeah.
reducing people's anxiety as they go through it?
Yeah, and I think communication is much undervalued, in fact, when it comes to change. And I know there's been lots written on communication, and but actually it's about different types of communication now. We're working in a hybrid world, so it's looking at what message has to go out, who does it have to go out to, but what's the right channel of communication. You know, we get lots of emails, and yes, often there's a need for emails these days, but change cannot be done by email. There has to be there has to be conversations. There may have to be videos, but it's looking at the best form of communication and making sure that everybody gets that. So just because an email is sent out about a change does not mean that people will read it, does not mean that they will understand it, because when we get communication, we all interpret it in different ways and we'll pick out certain things from it. So communication needs to have feedback built into it. That is vital, particularly when the message is important and has an impact on people's jobs and ways of working. So there has to be feedback loops, but also importantly, there has to be repetition too. Just because somebody, has said something about change once does not mean that we've all got it. We need to be told several times and in different ways. The other thing that's really important with communication is the language that's used too. So many communications come down from the top and they're written in a business speak that most of us just cannot identify with at all. So it's adapting the language of the communication to suit the audience that is vital. But as I say, it's having that feedback loop. So if people think, what does this mean? They have opportunities to actually raise questions, concerns that they may have.
And obviously this again is a new kind of skill set using different platforms, and like sort of saying, not everyone is ready to hear it at that particular time. They might be ready further on down the line when it's actually directly impacting them as well. Is this something that needs to be sort of outsourced to a comms team, or is this something that managers can actually step into and start developing to their practice?
Yeah, I think it's about managers need to be able to communicate effectively when it comes to anything to do with change. But what is also important is that managers themselves are involved in the communication. The challenge is that often managers are that they hear from the top down, this change is going to happen. They haven't been involved in any of the discussions about it. So there's a real need to ensure that managers are engaged from as early a stage as possible and any discussions about change itself. Now, what it's worthwhile saying a caveat here, because I appreciate that sometimes there is not time to engage people in change. So if you think about it, when the pandemic hit, we didn't have time to sit around discussing what are we going to do. Certainly here at the business school, one day I was teaching in the class, the next day I was teaching online. There wasn't time to engage us on whether we wanted to teach online or not. So we have to recognize that sometimes it's not feasible to engage people. But what I'm saying is whenever it is feasible, then absolutely the space should be created to engage stakeholders in organizational transformations as early as possible.
Yeah, and I guess because there are different types of change. Sometimes there's a regulatory change, or it's just imposed on you. I guess you have to build that trust and goodwill when the sun is shining, so that should a change be required, the employees will give you the benefit of the doubt because you've been transparent, you've been participative in previous change initiatives as well.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that you make, that trust is vital for change. Trust is very fragile in organizations. Trust takes a long time to build up, but it can be broken immediately. So yes, trust is vital, and it's about building up, integrity, being open and honest about organizational changes, coming from a benevolent stance as well, and all of these elements help to build trust too. Yeah. And when it comes to communication, people have to have trust in the person that is doing the communication as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're obviously you're really talking to the role of the middles, isn't it? Which is it's such an important role. They're kind of interpreting the change and translating it for their people. They're also feeding it back up again. They've got so many responsibilities, to a certain extent. They are, responsible for the mental health of their employees, like all these different things they're having to monitor for. And then this is another thing on top, isn't it? So How do we support our middle managers through times like this? Because it's a challenging role, isn't it, at the best of times?
Absolutely. And that's what I've written about in the new book. It's actually about reframing the role of middle managers and other managers. So getting rid of all of the transactional stuff that they deal with and giving them the space where they can actually facilitate change, where they can be present for change, where they can be engaged in the change themselves, but also they can engage their staff in the change too.
Mm. And you talk about engaging opponents of change.
Mm.
There's always that phrase, it's better to have them in the tent than out the tent, isn't there? I'm not sure we probably can't describe it in detail like that. How do you engage? Because sometimes, like you're saying, people might have vested interest in retaining the status quo. They might have a perception that their job will become insecure if it's changed.
Yeah.
They may be ideologically against it because they just don't believe that's the direction the organization needs to go in, or they've seen changes from centralized to decentralized to back to centralized again because they've been there for 10 plus years. How do we engage those opponents of change?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's finding out what are their perspectives. You know, we can all sort of, if we're all walking past the garden one morning, we will all have seen different things in that garden. You know, you'll have seen different things to what I have seen in it. So we all have different perspectives when it comes to organizational change. So it's about finding out what are these perspectives. Do they have any credence? So are they, you know, is somebody raising issues because they need to be dealt with, or are they just doing it because they were being, you know, they're being stubborn and that's their nature? But it is about finding out what is the perspective, where are they coming from, but also importantly, for managers and others to share their perspective as well. It has to be, you know, communication has to be two-way, but it also has to be up, down, and across the organization too. So it is about taking some time to understand what is driving somebody's behavior. And it's not about, I would say it's, people might think about, okay, you're giving people autonomy here. That's could be a bit dangerous, a bit risky. It's about putting in guardrails that's really important. So what's negotiable and what's non-negotiable with the change? What can people influence and what can't they influence as well? That's important. So it's being very clear when you're having these discussions about what are the guardrails that are in place here.
Yeah, because I think sometimes people think in polarities, don't they? Which is, if I don't have all the control, then it's almost like it's chaos, and the change won't be what we want it to be as well. I think, is it Gwen Sterling Wilkins sort of described it as freedom in a framework. So give people the freedom to actually make changes, and when you share that responsibility with people, they'll often step up into it and take great responsibility. So it's not so much on the middle managers and the senior managers to lead the direction.
Indeed. Yeah. And I mean, change has to it doesn't happen because managers and you know, people at the top have decided it's going to happen. It doesn't. It happens because, you know, the people that are doing the jobs make the changes, that they are actually changing the ways that they're working. They're using new systems, they're using new processes as well. The challenge, if people are not engaged, is that because we're all very clever, we can go back to the way it was before. And I've seen so many change programs that have been implemented, but the changes and the benefits from the changes have not been sustained because people have very slowly gone back to using or working in how they used to do. And that's a complete waste because it means that there's no benefits come out of the change itself. So that's why it's also important to gauge people so that they take ownership and responsibility and ensure that the change becomes business as usual. It's no longer a change, it's business as usual.
Can I ask you just one optional question? You can choose whether to. Obviously, the big topic, the nationwide discussion at the moment is about the post office and the changes that have what happened in there. Clearly, you know, a big digital transformation project that has unrolled. What are some of the lessons learned that organisations can take away from that?
So first of all, why was it not evaluated? Why did somebody not recognize that this wasn't just one person that was being affected, but it was, you know, hundreds of people, in fact. So it needs to be evaluated, definitely. There needs to be, I think, some monitoring of the implementation of that system. And clearly there was no monitoring at all about it. There was no follow-up, in fact. But also it goes right back to, was it the right system in the first place that was implemented? You know, who made that decision about that? Were people in the post office involved in actually deciding what the best type of system there was for them too?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating story, isn't it? It really has perked people's interest in what happens with change in organizations as well. I guess it also, do you find that organizations don't necessarily reflect on previous changes they've done and extract the lessons learned from them as well?
Absolutely. It's one of the key things that needs to be done more often, is actually not just at the end of a business transformation, but at different stages throughout it, to take time to look at what's going well, what's not going so well, and what could be done differently too. So that does need to be built into it. And perhaps if there'd been more of that evaluation and monitoring with the post office, and it had been more open and transparent, it wouldn't have reached the end state that it did.
Yeah, and I guess sometimes it becomes the sunk cost fallacy. We've gone so far, we we can't go back.
Yeah, but sometimes you have to change the change. You know, sometimes the decision has to be made. Actually, this system is not working, and you have to stop and say, what do we do next? And it takes a lot of courage, I think, to do that, rather than continuing on and implementing something like the post office system that was clearly not fit for purpose and had an impact on lots and lots of innocent people.
And just while we have you, we've got a lot of people that are coming to the session, come from the HR profession, and you've done some extensive study on the changing nature of the HR profession and how it needs to adapt. We're asking organizations to change with the context. What were some of the research findings you found in terms of how HR needs to evolve and develop?
So I did a global research study a couple of years ago, and I think out of that was, and it came from often, at certain times there's always this focus on HR that says, are HR relevant or not? The important thing from that study was that absolutely HR are relevant, and HR are really relevant when it comes to change in organizations. However, there needs to be a significant shift from the transactional type of HR. So HR need to look, and I know lots of HR teams are, how they can effectively utilize technology that frees them up from all the classic transactional activities they do to be much more transformational. So where they can work alongside the business in terms of facilitating and supporting change, not doing the change, because the change should be done by managers and employees, etc. But HR have a really key role to play in supporting and facilitating that too. And they're the experts when it comes to the people element in organizations.
Yeah, sometimes the temptation is for HR is to own too much almost, isn't it? And really the value is in them facilitating. But I guess that's a sort of a shift in identity from that sort of support service to really partnering and having
Absolutely.
brave conversations and being, really linked to the operation
Yeah.
of the organization as well.
Indeed, and it does mean pushing back, because often, management will ask HR to do things that actually management should be taking responsibility for as well.
Brilliant. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you, Julie, for your time answering my many questions. I've really enjoyed preparing for the interview and reading all the different things that you've sort of shared in your book as well. And I'm really looking for it coming out on the February the 3rd as well, which I understand is available on Amazon. Is that right?
That's right, Amazon, and also via Kogan page as well.
Brilliant. So all we'll do is in the show notes with this interview, we'll make sure that all of that is available. If anybody wants to contact you, if they've got questions, what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah, two ways. I'm really active on LinkedIn, so please connect with me on LinkedIn. I do post there about change in organizations on a regular basis. And also you're very welcome to drop me an email. My email is julie.hodges@durham.ac.uk.
Brilliant. Well, we shall really look forward to seeing you at the CIPD London event coming up in February. Thank you so much, Julian, and really good luck with your book launch as well.
Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure to talk with you today.